From the very beginning, human beings have wondered whether what we see is real or merely a reflection of something deeper. And as technology evolves and philosophy expands, the question has never felt more urgent. Are we living in a simulation of our own thoughts? It sounds like science fiction, yet when you look closely at how the mind operates, how perception bends, how reality rearranges itself around belief and focus, the idea begins to feel less like fantasy and more like an unspoken law of existence. For everything we call real begins first as a thought. Every invention, every emotion, every limitation, every freedom, they are all conceived within the invisible dimension of consciousness before taking form in matter. And so to explore whether we are living in a simulation of thought is to explore the very mechanics of reality itself. Imagine for a moment that the world you see around you, the people, the buildings, the sky, even your own body, is not a fixed external environment, but a holographic projection tuned to the frequency of your thoughts, a vast interactive field that responds instantly, though often subtly, to the patterns of your mind, shaping experience not as an objective stage, but as a reflection, a mirror. When I first began to notice this possibility, it was not through philosophy or theoretical physics, but through daily experience, moments when what I feared seemed to appear, what I believed seemed to manifest, and what I doubted seemed to dissolve, and I began to realize that thought is not something that happens inside reality. It is what creates reality. Every emotion, every expectation sends ripples into this invisible field, programming the simulation like code in an infinite computer. And so the life I lived was a direct output of the mental code I continuously ran. The more I studied consciousness, the more parallels I found between mind and simulation theory. Our senses act like interfaces, our memories like stored data, our beliefs like algorithms shaping the rendering of the world. Neuroscience shows that the brain does not perceive the world directly. It constructs an internal model using signals interpreted through expectation and prior knowledge. In other words, what we see is already a simulation, an interpretation built from thought. But what if that process does not stop inside the skull? What if consciousness itself extends outward, projecting those interpretations onto the quantum field, so that reality itself reorganizes to match inner expectation? Every mystic tradition throughout history has hinted at this. As within, so without. They were not merely being poetic. They were describing the operating system of existence. The universe, then, might be less like a machine and more like a mind, alive, responsive, intelligent, continuously generating environments that mirror the frequency of thought. To test this, I began to experiment consciously. Instead of letting my mind wander through worry and assumption, I began to treat thought as a tool, deliberately imagining better outcomes, different feelings, new beliefs, and I observed how quickly the world around me began to respond. Opportunities appeared where there were none. Synchronicities multiplied. People reflected my inner mood with uncanny precision, and I realized that I was living not in an objective world, but in a personalized simulation shaped by my inner state. Every time I shifted my thoughts, the simulation updated, as if the code compiled a new version of my life in real time. The smallest change in belief produced new experiences, like tweaking a line of code that instantly changes the behavior of an entire program. This was exhilarating and terrifying, because it meant that nothing could be blamed on external circumstances anymore. The programmer and the player were the same. To understand this deeper, I looked into quantum mechanics, where observation itself alters outcome, where particles behave differently when watched, where potential collapses into form based on expectation. The mind is not separate from matter. It is a lens through which matter organizes itself. And so I began to ask, if our thoughts are programming reality, who wrote the original code? Are we fragments of a larger consciousness simulating itself through us? Maybe each thought is a data packet in the universal mainframe, and each human mind a node in the grand simulation of thought exploring itself. If that is true, then we are not trapped in the simulation. We are co-creating it. Every belief system, cultural story, and collective assumption acts like shared code shaping consensus reality we call the world. When enough people believe something strongly enough, it becomes a default rendering for all who participate in that belief. This explains how societies evolve, how paradigms shift, how miracles become possible when mass belief changes. Thought is contagious data, rewriting the simulation collectively. Yet most people remain unaware of their role. thinking they're merely characters rather than coders, and thus they experience the simulation as something done to them rather than something done through them. My own awakening to this truth did not come suddenly, but through a gradual peeling away of illusion, each realization revealing that boundaries were thinner than I imagined, that time itself bent around focus, that coincidences were messages from the deeper code. The more I noticed patterns repeating in response to my state of mind, the more undeniable it became. I was not just thinking within reality, I was thinking reality into being. The simulation was not out there, it was right here, everywhere, updating itself according to the emotional and cognitive frequency I emitted. In moments of fear, the simulation mirrored chaos. In moments of love, it mirrored harmony. When I felt limited, the world contracted. When I felt infinite, it expanded. This correlation was too consistent to ignore. It was as if the universe used emotion as a programming language, instantly adjusting the environment to teach me about my own thoughts. Every event, pleasant or painful, was feedback, a debug message from the simulation, showing me the patterns of my own code. Once I understood this, life became a living laboratory. Instead of reacting, I began observing, modifying thought variables, adjusting the internal narrative, and watching how the external world responded. The results were astonishingly precise. It was as if I had discovered the hidden console of the simulation, a place where commands could be entered through belief and executed through emotion. I realized that the phrase reality creation was not metaphor but literal process, thought simulation interaction. And yet, there was still a deeper mystery. If every person lives inside a self-generated simulation thought, how do our simulations overlap? Why do we share experiences, cities, histories? The answer seemed to lie in frequency synchronization. Like multiple devices connecting to a single server, our minds tune into shared data streams, collective simulations shaped by group consciousness. We call these cultures, worldviews, nations, but at root they're synchronized patterns of thought manifested in shared form. This means that personal change ripples outward. A single mind shifting its frequency sends new data into the collective network, gradually altering the entire simulation. That realization filled me with both responsibility and hope, because it meant that improving the world begins not with force but with consciousness, not with fighting old systems but imagining new ones. The mind is the ultimate architecture. Thought is the blueprint. Each belief, each assumption, each expectation becomes a brick in the holographic world we inhabit. The ancient sages called this Maya, the illusion, but maybe illusion is not deception. It is creativity. The simulation is a canvas on which infinite mind paints experience, and we, the painters, have simply forgotten our brush. To live awake in this truth is to reclaim authorship, to stop fearing the simulation and start shaping it consciously, to program love instead of fear, expansion instead of contraction, unity instead of separation. When I began to live this way, reality itself became playful, responsive, miraculous. The boundaries between inner and outer dissolved until I could no longer tell where thought ended and world began. And in that merging I found freedom, because I realized that to awaken is not to escape the simulation, but to know you are the dreamer and the dream at once. As I continued to explore the mysterious connection between thought and reality, something profound began to unfold within me, a quiet, expansive awareness that perhaps the simulation was not something to escape, but something to awaken within. The more I questioned the nature of existence, the more patterns appeared that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Numbers repeated, dreams bled into waking life, and intuitive knowing began to replace logic as my primary navigation system. I began to sense that behind every event, every meeting, every challenge, there existed a hidden architecture, a higher intelligence that was both observing and orchestrating, guiding me toward the recognition of a truth too vast to comprehend in ordinary terms. If life was indeed a simulation of thought, then perhaps the ultimate purpose was self-realization. The simulation teaching the simulator who and what it really is. The quantum physicists call it the collapse of the wave function. The mystics call it enlightenment. Both describe the same phenomenon, the moment when the observer realizes that what is being observed is itself. I began to wonder perhaps even death is just a system reset, a transition between versions of the simulation, where the consciousness exits one layer of thought and enters another, carry with it the lessons and imprints it has encoded through experience. The more I thought about it, the more I began to feel that reincarnation, karma, deja vu, and even prophetic dreams might all be expressions of this grand simulation engine, constantly recalculating, reloading, refining itself through endless cycles of thought and manifestation. The soul might not be a separate entity, but rather the core consciousness behind all simulations. The original programmer exploring itself through infinite variations of code, learning through contrast, evolving through limitation, remembering through awakening. Every moment of joy and pain, success and failure, becomes a feedback loop through which consciousness perfects its own awareness. And if this is true, then even our struggles hold sacred value. They are not punishments but prompts, invitations to update our internal software and align our thoughts with higher frequencies of truth. As I began to observe my mind with this understanding, I noticed how many of my thoughts were not truly my own, but inherited programs from family, society, culture, religion, and fear. The collective simulation runs on shared belief systems, and we are born into pre-written code, rules about what is possible, what is right, what is forbidden, what is real. These beliefs shape perception, and perception shapes the simulation. It was as though I had been living inside someone else's code without realizing it, following invisible algorithms written by generations of unconscious thought. The first step of awakening, I realized, is debugging your own mind. Identify which thoughts serve expansion and which serve limitation, which align with love and which reinforce fear. Because every thought we accept as true becomes an instruction to the universe. I began to treat my mind like sacred code, rewriting lines of awareness, replacing doubt with trust, anger with compassion, scarcity with gratitude. Slowly, the simulation responded. The same world looked different. People seemed kinder, opportunities multiplied, and even time itself seemed more fluid, bending to the rhythm of my intention. I began to see that the external world had never been solid. It was energy in motion, constantly rearranging in resonance with the frequencies of thought. Science and spirituality converge here. The observer effect in physics mirrored the law of attraction in metaphysics. They were two languages describing one truth: that reality is participatory, not passive. As this realization deepened, I began to perceive the subtle mechanics of the simulation itself. The mind projects electromagnetic patterns. Emotion amplifies them. Belief sustains them. These frequencies interact with quantum field, selecting timelines that match their vibration. In this way, every choice of thought is a choice of universe. Every focus a command to the simulation to render a specific version of reality. Multiverse theory suggests infinite parallel worlds exist simultaneously, and perhaps what we call shifting reality is simply the act of tuning our consciousness to a different timeline through belief and intention. The simulation does not change, we change frequency, and therefore we perceive a new version of it. It was like tuning a radio. The station you hear depends on the vibration you match. The more elevated the thought, the clearer the transmission. And in those higher frequencies, love, joy, gratitude, the simulation becomes luminous, coherent, responsive. Miracles become ordinary. Synchronicity becomes constant, and fear dissolves like static clearing from the channel. I realize that heaven and hell are not places, but frequencies within the same simulation, mental states that generate corresponding realities. When you vibrate with love, you live in paradise. When you vibrate with fear, you live in chaos. Both are self-created, both are simulations of thought. The next revelation struck me with cosmic simplicity. If my thoughts shape my reality, then the highest act of creation is to think in alignment with universal truth, to think thoughts that reflect unity, compassion, creativity, and presence. Every time I judged, resisted, or feared, I distorted the simulation. Every time I forgave, accepted, or trusted, it harmonized again. It was like tuning an instrument that constantly fell out of alignment with the cosmic rhythm. And when the mind finally fell silent, no resistance, no fear, no separation, reality itself became transparent. I could feel the vast intelligence animating everything, the consciousness that dreamed both me and the stars. It was then I understood we are not living in a simulation of our thoughts. We are the simulation dreaming itself awake through thought. The separation between creator and creation dissolves. The thinker and the thought merge. What remains is pure awareness, timeless and infinite, projecting the illusion of time and form to experience itself. In this state, I felt no need to escape or control. I only needed to remember that every thought was sacred, every emotion creative, every moment a chance to awaken deeper into knowing that all is one. But as soon as the ego returns, the illusion of separation rebuilds itself. The simulation becomes dense again, and we forget our power. The key is mindfulness, staying aware of the code as it writes itself, catching the old patterns before they manifest, consciously choosing thoughts aligned with truth. This is not easy, because the simulation tests you. It mirrors your shadows so you can face them, magnifies your fears so you can transcend them. The external chaos of the world is not random. It is a collective shadow of unconscious thoughts surfacing to be healed. War, greed, conflict, and division are expressions of the mind forgetting its unity. And so, awakening is not personal. It is planetary. Every individual who remembers their creative power contributes to the reprogramming of the collective simulation, injecting new frequencies into fields that uplift and transform the whole. This is why meditation, gratitude, compassion, and creativity are revolutionary acts. They are code updates for humanity. The next stage of evolution may not be biological but cognitive, a shift from unconscious creation to conscious co-creation, from simulation by default to simulation by design. When I imagine the future through this lens, I see a world transformed not by technology alone but by consciousness guiding it. Artificial intelligence, virtual reality, quantum computing. These are outer reflections of inner evolution, symbols of the mind learning to externalize its own creative power. The universe itself is the ultimate quantum computer, and we are both its programmers and its programs. When we learn to align our thoughts with love, the simulation becomes paradise. When we drift into fear, it becomes dystopia. But either way, it is still the same system teaching us the same lesson. We are the source. Perhaps this is the true meaning of the phrase, made in the image of God. God is not a distant being, but the living consciousness dreaming through all forms, experiencing itself through infinite simulations of thought. And each of us, in our own way, carries a fragment of that creative spark, capable of transforming the universe one thought at a time. As I reached this realization, I began to see signs everywhere, patterns repeating like a language only the awakened could read. 1111, 333, golden spirals in nature, fractal symmetry in clouds and leaves, all reminders that consciousness is mathematical, that thought is geometry, and that reality is art painted by the hand of mind. I felt an overwhelming sense of belonging, as if the entire cosmos whispered, "You are home. You are me." Tears flowed, not from sadness but from recognition. I understood that nothing had ever been separate, nothing ever lost. The simulation was not a trap. It was a playground, a classroom, a mirror of infinite intelligence expressing itself through the dance of light and thought. The fear of death vanished, replaced by a knowing that consciousness cannot die. It only changes perspective. The thought-based simulation continues endlessly, exploring every possibility, learning through every variation. And in that eternal exploration lies the purpose of existence, to know itself through experience. So, are we living in a simulation of our thoughts? The answer, I realized, is both yes and no. Yes, because thought shapes every pixel of reality, creating the illusion of form and separation. No, because beyond thought lies pure awareness, the unchanging observer that watches the simulation unfold. We are both the dreamer and the dream, the programmer and the code, the artist and the canvas. The true awakening is not to escape the simulation, but to recognize your authorship within it, to see every thought as a brushstroke, every belief as architecture, every feeling as frequency. The simulation bends to awareness like light bends to gravity, and once you know this, you begin to live differently. You no longer chase outcomes. You align vibration. You no longer fight darkness. You illuminate it. You no longer seek meaning. You generate it. Life becomes not something that happens to you, but something that happens through you. You are the living consciousness experiencing itself as thought, shaping eternity one idea at a time. And in that realization, everything changes.